Chapter 24. In Search of the Past. Retracing Steps to Mount Taikang. For some reason, Shilian was suddenly filled with courage again. After Lang Chenqiu had left, Shilian's steps had been hesitant, his shoulders slumped. But this courage came from nowhere, and it was hard to say where it would go. All Shilian knew was that it made him stand tall once more. He stood unmoving, and Shi Qingsheng approached, giving him a small pat on the back. "What a guy! Your Highness, I don't know how you managed to befriend him, but you're very lucky." It was rare for Shilian to hear someone tell him he was lucky. He glanced at Shi Qingsheng and smiled. "Really? Maybe. I think so too." Behind them, Feng Xin continued to wipe his face wordlessly. When the two turned their heads, they saw his face covered in white strands, miserable and unkempt, and they had to work to hold back their laughter. "Sorry about that," Shilian said. That counted as an apology on Hua Cheng's behalf. Feng Xin finally picked off all the white strands from his face. "I'm not as skilled as him, so there's nothing to say." The three of them conducted a final sweep of all the caves, double-checking to make sure there were indeed no more humans or anything else left behind, before riding a draft of wind back to the Heavenly Court. Once they passed the gates, they saw that the streets were filled with crowds of junior officials from the middle court, moving about, checking every nook and cranny of every palace as if they were about to face a grave enemy. When they finally arrived at the Palace of Divine Might, the hall was already filled with heavenly officials of the upper court, and even from afar, they could hear them arguing. The first thing they heard was, "Hua Cheng dares accuse the upper court of the heavens of sending a spy? How ludicrous! Why would the heavenly realm need to send a spy?" Shilian and Shi Qingsheng cleared their throats lightly when they heard. Sending a spy was most likely the truth. Nothing had been settled yet, and the officials already couldn't wait to start blathering. If the accusation was indeed true, wouldn't they be putting their foot in their mouth? The three entered the hall with Shi Qingsheng in the lead. When the crowd saw him, they greeted, "The Lord Windmaster has returned. Thank you for your hard work." But all eyes were on Shilian. They were about to press for more, but saw Feng Xin emerge from behind them, looking like he had crawled out of a bloody pond, his face dark. Everyone was frozen onto the spot and immediately turned their eyes away. After all, no one wanted to be loudly cursed out in the Great Hall. Only Muqing held his gaze. He not only didn't care to avoid him, but he purposely stared, his intent more than obvious. Shilian raised his eyes and saw Jun Wu seated above on his throne. With a hand propping up his head and fingers pressed against his temple, his eyes were closed and he looked exhausted. Shilian could understand exactly how he felt. In the past, there might not have been any conferences or meetings of this sort for months at a time, but with all the incidents that had happened recently, the Palace of Divine Might was filled to the brim time and time again. It was as if there was a situation every day, and they'd have to convene twice for each. If Shilian were in his shoes, he'd be tired too. Besides, there were many that wanted to have their voices heard, and they babbled away. One of the officials exclaimed, "He came and went as he willed. Scary to think that he was able to connect to the palace of Shenle to somewhere else. Now that he showed, he can easily kidnap His Highness who offended him. Who knows if he'll kidnap any other heavenly officials? We can't possibly let this go. We need to stop him right now." If this were the mortal realm, it would be akin to a rebel digging a tunnel beneath the royal palace and sneaking about freely. Of course people were uneasy. No wonder the middle court officials were busy searching and safeguarding the grounds. Muqing, on the other hand, had something else to say. He said coolly, "Hua Cheng has so many devotees, and he lords over Ghost City. Something minuscule like burning his palace manor would be nothing to him. He might not have broken into the heavens just because His Highness offended him." Shi Qingsheng immediately countered, "General Shenzhen, you're mistaken. Everyone heard Hua Cheng admit it himself. Speaking of, which general is responsible for security this month? Isn't it a dereliction of duty that the Palace of Shenle had the connection spell cast upon it without that general even noticing?" Pei Ming had been standing quietly on the side, unperturbed, and with his arms crossed. When he heard Shi Qingsheng, he spoke up. "Me." Shi Qingsheng had accidentally remembered wrong and thought it was Muqing on duty, but he'd ended up calling out Pei Ming, and now things were somewhat awkward. However, Pei Ming didn't push off the blame. "I'm on duty this month. This is my oversight." A heavenly official who was on good terms with Pei Ming immediately tried to help him out of the predicament. If you ask me, we should just look at these matters one case at a time. Let's first clear up the issue in regards to the Gilded Banquet massacre. Just then, Ling Wen, who was positioned next to the throne, suddenly spoke up. We've news from His Highness Tai Hua. Jun Wu finally opened his eyes. What did he say? Ling Wen was quiet for a moment, then she replied, He states that there is another side to the story of the Gilded Banquet massacre. He will resolve this conflict with His Highness himself, and there's no need for anyone else to interfere. Also, that His Highness's request for banishment must not go through. Those are the two things. What other side? Mu Qing frowned. He didn't say anything more. That is all, Ling Wen replied. To think that they would see a battle erupt and a hammer come down heavily, only to have it land as lightly as a feather, the heavenly officials couldn't help but feel rather disappointed. Lang Chenchou was the plaintiff, and the plaintiff was no longer accusing the defendant. So what fun was there to be had watching? Besides, Lang Chenchou wasn't telling, and Shi Lian didn't look like he was going to say anything either, so there was nothing more to chew on in this matter. Following Ling Wen's report, Jun Wu appointed Feng Xin and Mu Qing to assist Pei Ming in strengthening security and settled a few other matters before waving his hand and dismissing everyone. Shen Le stayed behind, and he could hear the faint conversations passing by. I knew it. Whenever he stirs up anything, the Emperor says he'll interrogate him, but in the end, nothing comes of it. We've been blind. He's actually someone significant. Gotta watch what we say from now on. Once everyone left, Shi Lian approached the throne and bowed. I've caused my lord problems. This does not count as a problem yet. The real problem was you stubbornly proclaiming yourself the only one responsible for the Gilded Banquet massacre. Shi Lian was hesitant, but in the end still gave an account of the whole story. After listening to the story, Jun Wu commented, Shen Le, in regards to your methods in managing this matter, you worked hard for nothing and pleased no one. Shi Lian hung his head. I know. Never mind. You are always like this, Jun Wu said. Tai Hua has now changed focus to pursue the Green Ghost. Once he succeeds, he will certainly return for you. Have you thought on how you will face him? Not yet, but let's focus on something else, Shi Lian replied. Jun Wu chuckled. Such as? Is it something interesting that can assist me? Is it something interesting that can amuse me? Was it my lord who sent the Earthmaster to Ghost City as a spy? Shi Lian asked. Yes, Jun Wu answered leisurely. Why? Jun Wu answered slowly. Because it was Hua Cheng who planted a spy in the heavenly realm first. Shi Lian was taken aback. Jun Wu stood. For many years, news has reached Hua Cheng's ears too quickly. There were many things he should not have known and instead knew too well. As for what can be done and what cannot be done, where the line is and how to cross said line, he is overly perceptive and precise. That he could connect directly to your palace of Shen Le only proves that he does indeed have a spy here in the heavenly realm. Otherwise, it could not have been done. To be honest, Shi Lian had noticed this too. After all, Hua Cheng really did know way too much. Hearing Jun Wu say it out loud, it wasn't hard to believe. Does my lord have any evidence? Shi Lian inquired. Jun Wu shook his head slowly. It is because there was no proof. But things were suspicious regardless, that I sent Ming Yi to the ghost realm. It was unexpected that Ming Yi fell into his hands before the spy was found. Although you saved him from Hua Cheng's grasp, now it will be even more difficult to find that spy. Is it the upper court or the middle court that's the problem? Shi Lian asked. Hard to say, Jun Wu said. Aside from you, it might be anyone. Perhaps there is only one mole. Perhaps more. No wonder Jun Wu didn't appoint anyone else to investigate Ming Yi's disappearance. If it could be anyone besides him, Shi Lian couldn't help but think. Even the Windmaster Chen Chou, Feng Xin, everyone is a possible agent. Just then, Jun Wu spoke. Shen Le, I know you think highly of Hua Cheng right now. You understand your own position, and others should not comment on the friends you make. However, when necessary, be wary of Hua Cheng. Do not give anything away. Hearing this, Shi Lian schooled his thoughts. Jun Wu continued, To become a supreme, one must have experienced unimaginable suffering and pain. One either ascends from such tribulations, or is doomed to the depths of hell, never to return. The two supreme ghost kings that emerged from Mount Tonglu, Blackwater and Hua Cheng, are both far more frightening than you think. Shi Lian lowered his head, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Jun Wu said, "I do not know what his objectives or directives are, but he knows the motives and movements of the upper court. That in itself is disadvantageous." When he heard the word disadvantageous, Shi Lian raised his head and blurted, "Sun Lung, he..." Seeing that Jun Wu turned his head to him, Shi Lian paused, then corrected himself. "Hua Cheng shouldn't do anything overly malicious. If my lord thinks about it, with his strength, should he have wanted to cause havoc and raise hell, he would have done so already. If he didn't before, then without reason he won't come in the future." "Pray that it will be so," Jun Wu said, "but you know I cannot take that risk." After leaving the Palace of Divine Might, Shi Lian paced slowly down the streets of the Heavenly Court. When he passed by the Palace of Shenle, he stopped to appraise it. This was the palace gifted to him by Jun Wu, resplendent, brand new, but also foreign. The large scarlet-red doors were shiny and bright, and were plastered with nailed-on talisman and charms, forming a giant X and cautioning anyone who should see. When Shi Qingshong left the Palace of Divine Might, he had told Shi Lian that his palace was currently sealed shut, since it was connected to elsewhere. So Shi Lian was welcome to rest at his palace instead. However, after staring at this Palace of Shenle for a while, Shi Lian suddenly turned on his heel. He didn't go to the Palace of the Windmaster either. He stopped caring what he was originally going to do, and instead headed straight to the Ascension Gates and jumped. Passing through the sea of clouds, his landing point was Mount Taikang. Upon the summit of Mount Taikang, there used to sit the cultivation center of the ancient kingdom of Shenle, the Royal Holy Temple. The Royal Holy Temple was an impressively expansive cultivation center. Its training grounds and temples covered the entirety of Mount Taikang, worshipping numerous gods and immortals alike, scintillating and glorious. The main god worshipped was the Heavenly Emperor, and his golden temple was situated on the highest peak. The Crown Prince Temple that once stood on the second highest peak was also a place of magnificent splendor. 800 years ago, Mount Taikang was renowned for its forests of flaming red maples, and within those maple groves were endless crowds of devotees. However, when the kingdom of Shenle fell, the crowds of devotees became crowds of angry rioters. They scaled the mountain to set ablaze to the Crown Prince Temple, but they ended up setting fire to the entirety of Mount Taikang, burning it down to nothing but blackened earth and ash. The burnt earth, like ground nourished by the dead, seemed to become even more fertile. Afterward, new seeds were planted upon the burnt earth, and new trees emerged. A few hundred years later, the mountain was fresh and covered once more, but the red leaves were no longer. The scenery was different from 800 years ago. When hiking the mountain in the past, there used to be a wide paved path bordered by greenery. On the path, one could often see a devotee or a young trainee hauling firewood or water. Now, this path was long gone. Rocks and debris, withered branches and sticks had covered its tracks and buried it deep underground. As Shi Lian climbed, he used only the strength of his legs, and when he ran into thorns or bushes, he took Fangshin and cut them down. When he reached halfway up the mountain, Shi Lian was fatigued and leaned against a dead tree, ready to rest. Suddenly, the black shadow of an object came crashing down from the branches, making odd crackling sounds as it rushed toward him. Shi Lian dodged. At first he thought it was a broken branch or a nest, but when he looked closer, it was a plank so rotten that its original shape was indiscernible, with two rusted steel chains connected to either side. If it were anyone else, they might not be able to tell what it was, but Shi Lian knew immediately that it was a swing. In the past, Mount Taikang had swings installed everywhere, both for fun and for training. Back when Shi Lian had only just started to retain memories, he once accompanied his parents to visit the Royal Holy Temple to pray for blessings. He saw a group of young trainees sparring, flipping and flopping all over the swings. It was an exciting performance. The king and queen enjoyed it, and Shi Lian clapped and shouted his appreciation. The king and queen were so pleased that they richly rewarded the young trainees, and ever since then, the impression was left deep in Shi Lian's heart that cultivation was something awesome and fun. Though, when he formally entered the sect for cultivation in his later years, the reason was no longer because it seemed fun. After some rest, Shi Lian continued hiking. The higher he climbed, the thicker the bushes became, and every so often, a critter would dart by, leaving behind a shadow of a bushy tail. There were a few squirrels huddling in the trees, munching on pine cones, peeking at this uninvited guest. Thorns blocked his path, tearing at his clothes and limbs, but Shilian didn't mind at all. 6 hours later, at last he reached the peak of the Crown Prince Summit. Of course, the Crown Prince Summit wasn't originally called the Crown Prince Summit, but the name was changed after the Crown Prince Temple was constructed. Amidst the bushes and weeds, there were still remnants of pebble-paved grounds here and there. These were hidden traces of the large, burned foundations of the temple's great hall. Growing across it, through the rubble and ruins, past tinted glass tiles, he reached a chipped old well.